Hello, welcome to today's episode of Back to the City. Today I'm really excited to be reunited with Kyle Tran Myhre, who viewers will recognize as Guante. It's been a few years since we last had an interview, and we've never really focused exclusively on your poetry. This book, Not a Lot of Reasons to Sing But Enough, is excellent and will be released by Button Poetry this coming Thursday. And it's such a pleasure to have this opportunity to dive into it with Kyle. There are two creators of this. There's Kyle and also Casper Farm. By establishing how this collaboration between the two creators came to be and what the contribution of the visual art is to the book.
Yeah, that's fun. I mean, right off the bat, when I know that when people hear like someone who's maybe more known as a musician talking about their poetry book, like right away, that can be kind of I don't know about that. But just so for anyone who doesn't know, like I've been doing poetry for as long as I've been doing music, and
Yes.
maybe even a little bit longer. And so this is definitely the continuation of a long thing. And that gets to the question about the visual art element, in that because I've been doing like releasing books and putting poems on online video and doing that kind of stuff for years now, it was really important for me to just do something a little different. And it's not that, having illustrations in a book of poetry is some revolutionary thing that no one's ever done before, but it was something that I felt that because of the specific like concept or hook or kind of framing device of the book would actually add something and not, just be a distraction. I think it could add to kind of the world building of the book. And so I ended up doing a bunch of research, talking to artist friends that I knew, because I wanted to make sure, one, if you're going to work with a visual artist, like to pay them what they need to be paid to have it to be a sustainable enterprise, but then also just kind of the nuts and bolts of how you approach people and contracts and stuff like that. So did a ton of online research, found portfolios of so many just incredible visual artists from all around. I was mostly looking in the US, and I think Casper at the time was based in the US. But it turns out that when I finally got in touch with them and we agreed to do the book together, it turns out that they had seen me perform before when I went and performed at the university, VCU in Virginia, and they'd happened to be in the audience for a show that I did probably 5-6 years ago.
Wow.
And so it's just one of those very like small world weird connections that happened to turn out. But I'm super happy with how the visual element of the book turned out in general. Casper also did the image that's on the cover, which also appears in the book later too.
Maybe let's zoom in on that moment. This is right at the beginning of the 9th part of the book, and the caption there is, "Just because you don't have the power to run outside and magically fix everything, it doesn't mean that you don't have power." Could you talk a little bit about the juxtaposition of this particular image by Casper and that line, and then the decision to have this become the cover?
To talk about that, I might have to back up a little bit and talk about the kind of the concept of the book, if that's okay.
Absolutely, please.
Because it's very much, again, coming from like a music background, I think of this book as very much a concept album in the same way you think about like Tran or, other famous concept albums throughout the years, and that it isn't just like, here's a collection of like 30 poems that I wrote, but it's actually a story. All the poems that are in the book are framed by this story of these two characters who are wandering this moon. It doesn't take place on the earth, it's on this moon somewhere else. They're wandering from like village to village on this moon. One of the characters is a robot. Like a bunch of the people in the book are robots. It doesn't really matter. It's not a metaphor for anything. It's just some people happen to be robots. The robot and their apprentice. And the apprentice is kind of the primary voice in the book. Like a lot of the poems are meant to come from that perspective. But then the poems in the book, sometimes it's the apprentice, sometimes it's people who this duo meet as they travel from village to village. The big like communal bonfires where people tell stories and sing songs. That's kind of the structure of the book, is going from village to village. And so some of the poems are that character, some of the poems are people that they meet. And then the actual, the kind of master poet who the apprentice is the apprentice of is this robot character, who is the character on the book. I don't know if that's ever
Hmm.
made super explicit, but at least in my head, it's this character.
Hmm.
And the chapter where this image appears is before the character doesn't really talk much throughout the book. They're kind of, even though they're one of the main characters, they're more in the background. The apprentice is really the primary driver of the narrative. But in this, one of these last chapters, this robot character suddenly talks a lot, because they're trying to make this larger point about how all the things we talk about when we write poems or write songs, like the kind of creative writing impulses, directly relate to organizing and activism too. There's this really interesting connection between how our brains go from like having an idea to writing a poem to revising that poem to having something that we care about in the world, and how do we actually like move on it? How do we take action around that? Which is such a simple thing, but also such a complex thing at the same time. And so that quote about power, which is, I will readily admit, is I've used in a couple different projects because it's something that means a lot to me. The quote is, just because you don't have the power to run out and magically fix everything, it doesn't mean that you don't have power. It's about recognizing the power that we have and the power that we don't have at the same time, and not kind of glamorizing like, the hero's journey of like one person who slays the dragon, but also not glamorizing the other side, that like nothing matters, we're all just nobodies. Like that there's actually work that has to be done in between those two ends of the spectrum to figure out what power we have. And that's kind of a running theme in the book, especially talking about art and artists and musicians, like that idea that there is power in art that like engages with important issues, social justice issues, political issues, but that power also has limits, and like just trying to think critically about what that power actually is. Versus, the kind of the easy, like the immortal beauty of art and how it makes us more human. And like, I don't disagree with all that stuff, but I'm much more interested in kind of where the rubber meets the road of that conversation. Like, what power does art actually have versus the kind of mythology of art?
This section of the book where Myhre speaks is called "Do You Really Think We Have Been Talking About Poetry This Whole Time?" And something I love about it, about this particular section, is that even here, as the character who has been presented as the true adept, so the master teacher kind of character, but here Myhre is being responsive to Nari, the apprentice's earlier lesson. Myhre addresses Nari and says, "Tell me about your shovels." So could you explain what's going on there? Much earlier in the book, there is a lesson about 3 different ways in which a shovel can be used. And here, at this moment where at last we hear, right near the end of the book, from the would-be master teacher, the master teacher is effectively asking the apprentice to just expand further on the earlier lesson. All of that is really intriguing, and I think key to what's going on in the book in terms of the message about leadership and power, the balancing act. We'll talk more about the balancing act in a bit. Could you elaborate on what's going on here? Tell me more about your shovels.
Yeah, I love that right away we get to talk about some of the deeper stuff in the book, because there's all kinds of kind of surface level things that I think other people will key in on, but like this is getting to like the meat of what the book really is about. And
Yes.
the idea is that, so earlier in the book there's so again, it's a poetry book, but it's only probably a half of the book is actual poems. It's also the conversations that the characters have kind of around the poems as they're moving from place to place. And so earlier in the book, there's a kind of chapter, I think it's called "The 3 Notes of Feedback I Leave with 99.9% of the people who ask me for feedback on their poems," or something like that. And it's very literally, I mean, this is me speaking through the character, but it's me because I do this kind of work, like working with young people in schools around creative writing. And it is very often the exact same 3 pieces of feedback that people, I don't want to say need, but that I offer. And in that essay, those pieces of feedback are framed as shovels, because it's like the metaphor there is that there's a million different ways to dig a hole. There's a million different reasons for digging a hole. And you might need different tools. You might need different approaches depending on what specific thing you're doing. But in a very general sense, as kind of just big, broad, foundational things, a shovel is like a useful tool for digging a hole. It might not be everything you ever need, but in general, so these are like three pieces of advice that like generally I found can be kind of light switch moments for a lot of young, aspiring and emerging writers. And so right away, like, again, if you're a creative writer, like I wanted that to be a really practical essay about like, here are things that I think about when I'm writing, things that have been useful to me. And then the later chapter reflects on that earlier one by kind of borrowing the structure from it, right?
Yes.
So there were these three pieces of feedback, but then kind of what I was saying earlier, how those three pieces of feedback for creative writers can also be applied to movement builders and activists. So
yes,
I can share just one example. If you're writing a poem and it's about, say, grief, right? A lot of people write about grief. It's easy to just get up on stage and be like, I feel bad. I feel sad. Grief makes me cry. I feel bad, right? Like, and those are true. Sometimes you just have to express yourself, and that's okay. But the lesson or the shovel in that particular essay is, how do you take big abstract things like grief, like sadness, like mourning, like death, these huge concepts, and how do you kind of translate them into something that is real for an audience? How do you turn them into an image or a story or like a moment from your memory in a way that can grab people and really make them pay attention? So it's not just that like grief is bad, it makes me feel bad, or I'm sad because you're gone, but how do you paint a picture? How do you tell a story? How do you do something that brings that large idea to life? That's very simple kind of creative writing 101 stuff. And then in the later essay, it's about taking that same concept. How do we take things that are really, really big, like racism or sexism or imperialism or colonialism or whatever, these like huge, giant, like world problems, and how do you translate them into something that is small, something that is concrete and actionable? And that's, it's not always an easy question, but I think for a lot of people, I'm speaking from my own experience here too, it can be easy to get caught up in our own heads about like, well, I don't know what the answer is to institutionalized white supremacy in the United States. And so I'm not going to do anything. Because when we only think of it as this big abstract thing, it's too much. It's too much to process. But when we can do that kind of creative writing, poetry work of translating it into a specific action, or another way to think about it is a first step, right? Like, even if you don't know how to fix the big problem, we can think about what our first step might be. It could be Googling like racial justice organizations in my city and just seeing what comes up. It could be following a bunch of people who talk about this on social media so that when there is a call to action or something happening, where to plug in. It could be, if you're a student, like taking a class that might put you on a path towards doing racial justice work in the future. Like, there are all these really like concrete, down to earth ways that, again, goes back to that quote about power, that we can find the power that we have.
I think the characters that are being addressed in that original scene turn out to be kind of 6 or so. They're young kids that are being addressed at that stage, aren't they? But here we have Nari. We find her in relationship with her mentor, and the central balancing act that's referred to at a few different moments throughout the book between humility and arrogance. I think this is a really interesting case in point of that, because I think she strikes that balance perfectly when she's addressing the kids. And yes, that is helpful advice. And it's presented with some reticence about giving advice, because there's this acknowledgement that it depends what we're doing. There's lots of different ways in which we could use a spade, but depending on what you're trying to do, maybe a spade is too much, maybe a spade isn't enough. That's explicitly acknowledged even in the first place. So she gets the balance right between humility and arrogance there. And then here, because she's addressing her mentor, she is able to be with her doubts. Like in this final 9th part of the book, that's a new focus with Hen March Am I getting that right? That's
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And actually, that's a really cool connection that I don't know if I had made that connection at first, because again, the whole conceit there is that these two pieces in the book that are far apart, but they're
Yeah,
referencing each other. And I think some of that is really straightforward, but I think that specific point about humility and arrogance is interesting, because when it first comes up in the book, it's very much about, for anyone out there who has stage fright, who doesn't like to be a public speaker, like, I make my living up in front of people talking, and I'm an incredibly introverted, like, anxious person. And so I wanted to share some, just again, really down to earth, practical tips and tools for that. And in that section, it was about cultivating both arrogance and humility. The humility to say, like, it doesn't matter, whatever, I'm going to do my thing. If people like it, they like it, I don't care. But also the arrogance of, like, yeah, I'm going to do my thing. If people don't like it, I don't care. Like, to cultivate a little bit of each one can help when you have to be up on stage in front of people. But then that same idea, again, this is the connection that I don't know if I made, but that same idea is really interesting when we talk about organizing and activism, about having the arrogance to believe that you can actually make a difference, because that's really important. If we don't have that, we just sit around doing nothing, right?
yeah,
And also the humility to know that, like, it's not going to be some one hero who saves the day, or like
totally.
is at the front taking up all the space. It's going to be a collaborative process in which people work together. So that's a cool connection. Can I share just one other quick thing?
Yeah, of course you can.
And this might be a later question, but there's a lot in the book about gender, because
Yes.
traditionally I write a lot about masculinity and do a lot of work around masculinity, um, and I just find it really fascinating that you read Neri, as, as feminine, or like you using she her pronouns.
I love the character Nari. It's so, it is so, because there's many, the reason why we haven't encountered Jairi very much throughout the book is that often there are multiple moments in the book where there are almost panel discussions, and in each of these cases, Nari is stepping in for her mentor. Yep. And in each of those cases, Nari highlights, I didn't realize it would be all men. Nari is so unlike these the toxic male voices that we encounter in those instances. Yeah, that's how I ended up kind of assuming, because Nari is so different from those voices. Let's stick with the humility and arrogance for a moment. So I've turned to the moment in the book, which is in a section called So-Called Career Day, where this advice about balancing humility and arrogance is first introduced. The key for me is how they exist in conversation with one another. And I think how things exist in conversation with one another, whether it's different aspects of the book, different characters, oneself as a poet, oneself as an activist, is key throughout the book. And yet there's also something really significant and central about this particular alchemy here of humility and arrogance. Specifically because if we have just one, then there is danger. This whole humility-arrogance balancing act is definitely useful as a public performer who is not at all comfortable around other people, but I think it's also useful beyond performance for anyone who wants to write, or even for anyone who wants to be their full selves in this ridiculous and often oppressive universe. I think that is so true, and I suspect that this balancing act of humility and arrogance is going to kind of pop up as relevant as we journey through different aspects of the book.
Yeah, I mean, if we were going to put our literature, like English literature grad student hats on,
Yes.
and kind of, because the book is about certain things on a surface level, and then I think that one of the deeper things that I really wanted the book to do was just push against the idea of kind of very binary thinking. We often think about binary thinking in terms of gender, but I think about it in terms of everything, that
Yeah.
everything has to be this or that, black or white, one or the other, and how important it is for things to be in, like you said, in conversation with each other. And that, I think, is I think a lot about content and form. Like when I do poetry classes with students, we talk about how, content is what a poem is about and form is the structure of it, like how it is put together, and how those two things aren't the same, that they're related, but they're not the same. And I think that same thing is true in a deeper, broader sense of like the content of the book is talking about certain things, but even on a formal level, it's always trying to push back. I don't want to get too meta about this, but the idea of absolutes, but even within that, there is still an absolute. And that comes up in the book at some point too. There's
Absolutely.
a piece called All Advice is Bad Advice, including the advice that all advice is bad advice. And I think that is, again, it's not trying to make one specific authoritative statement about this, that, or the other, but it's about encouraging us and reminding, like writing to remind myself to step back and see how different ideas are in conversation with each other
Yeah,
versus seeing which idea is the one good idea or the one bad idea, but
totally.
how they juxtapose, how they alter each other by virtue of being.
And I feel when arrogance is in fruitful conversation, fruitful, respectful conversation with humility, then we end up with confidence in one's capacity to participate, to engage with, to encounter in a meaningful way, to play a part in a story where potentially there's scope for us to all co-create, to all be heroes. For those who see that possibility, to have the arrogance or confidence to be able to communicate and feed that, sow the seeds that could grow into that reality is key. You call upon both humility and arrogance, and then Henmarch, we'll start focusing on Henmarch now, listens to all the voices, because just don't listen to them isn't any kind of serious advice. She decides that if they were going to yap away at her anyway, she may as well get to know them. And I feel that there's an interesting conversation that could be had between this moment where Henmarch, who is another would-be savior hero, if there is one kind of savior hero character, it is Henmarch. And yet, just as the book is reticent about giving advice, Henmarch is kind of reticent about being cast as a savior or a hero, of course. Could you expand a bit on this character, Henmarch, what the significance of Henmarch is in general, and how this willingness to listen to all the voices, all the inner voices, all the external voices as well, kind of maybe relates to what the conversation about things being in conversation that we've been having.
Yeah, so that's another kind of structural piece of the book, in that the main narrative, like the spine that all the poems in the book kind of are attached to, is again the two characters, Jair and Neri, walking from village to village as performers. They're like touring performers on this other world. Again, we haven't even gotten into the whole concept of why these people are even on this other world, but
They're
it's a moon and
exiles.
they travel from village to village, right? Yeah, they're
Yep.
exiles. And then the Henmarch series is a series of, in my head, I think of them as tall tales, like kind of folklore about this foundational character who existed many years before the two main characters. And the timeline is intentionally left a little bit complex, and that it could be 100 years ago, it could be 300 years ago, it could be 50 years ago. Like we don't entirely know, but it's this character who lived and died many, many years ago, who has kind of become like I think less like a real kind of foundational figure, like again to think about the US like a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson or whatever, and more like a Robin Hood,
Yeah.
like maybe was real, maybe was more of a folklore, maybe more of a combination of different people smashed together. But Henmarch is this character who, through these tall tales that people tell around the fire or to their kids or whatever, kind of embody the values of this new culture. Because all the people who live on this moon were exiled from this other world, and so they had to develop a new culture of their own. There wasn't anyone else on the moon either. There's interesting stuff. I try to be very, very careful in the book to say that this is not a metaphor for like refugee issues or immigrant issues or colonialism. This is a very weird sci-fi thing where people, if anything, if there's a metaphor going on, it's maybe has to do more with prison and punishment, and how this group of people was separated from the world that they lived on. And their memories were all messed with and taken away. And so it's basically this like new society growing on this moon. They develop a music and a poetry and a culture. And Hen March, again, is kind of the mouthpiece for that culture, even as that culture starts to turn against what she stood for. Because, you know, again, if there's a elevator pitch or like a one-line thing of what the book is about for me, it's what is the role of art and artists in resisting authoritarianism. So the narrative is that even though Hen March had all these incredible ideals, as the larger culture kind of moves in the other direction, what do the characters do? Like, what do the two poets do in the midst of all that push and pull of culture and politics?